Okay, so in this next section of our learning, we're going to talk about the corrupt bargain, which is the election of 1824, and that's going to bring to power John Quincy Adams. He's only going to last for 4 years as president, sort of a repeat of his father, and complete disappointment. And then we're going to see the election, the double election of Andrew Jackson. He gets elected twice, 1828 and 1832. And it's sort of a vindication for Jackson because he loses in 1824. And he's really bitter about that. The whole country is bitter about that. So let's deal with the election of 1824 first. So in 1824, you have essentially 5 guys who are going to run for president who enter the election. You have William Crawford, who was the Secretary of the Treasury. He's nominated by the Republican Party as their presidential candidate. He's one of 5 guys, okay? He received 62 votes, okay? Now, Crawford's got a major issue. He's from Georgia, and he's going to have a major issue as we grow closer to the end-all, be-all of this election because he has a stroke. Right before the actual election. So here we have a guy who's basically incapacitated who still receives 62 votes for president, 62 electoral votes, and he has a stroke. Whoopsie, we have a problem, okay? Now, you also have Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House. He's running for president, okay? He puts his name forward from Kentucky, and he believes he'd be an excellent choice for president. You know, Henry Clay is his own biggest fan, okay? You also have John Quincy Adams, who runs for president from Massachusetts, okay? Former Secretary of State. You also have Secretary of War John Calhoun from South Carolina. He decides to run, but he finds out that Andrew Jackson is going to run for president, so John Calhoun actually pulls out of the race in order to make room for Andrew Jackson. He doesn't want to run against Andrew Jackson, so he pulls out of the race and he accepts a nomination as vice president. So Calhoun's out, Jackson is in. So that brings us down to basically 4 candidates because Jackson is in. So you've got Crawford, Jackson, Clay, Adams. But Crawford, see, from Georgia, he's really, he had a stroke, but he's still one of the top vote getters. So here's the problem. So we have several problems, actually. We have Crawford with the stroke. We have Andrew Jackson, who's probably the least qualified of the guys running for president because he has no experience in public service whatsoever. He has a successful military career, but that's about it. But he's the most popular among the electorate. And he has, in 1824, he has no trouble winning the largest number of popular and electoral votes. But the problem is that nobody wins the majority of the electoral votes. And that's what the Constitution says. The Constitution says you have to win the majority of the electoral votes. Well, nobody gets that. So Jackson wins the most, but not the majority. Adams comes in second, okay, and Crawford, even though he suffers a debilitating stroke during the campaign, he comes in third. Clay comes in a demoralizing 4th. He's just humiliated, but the Constitution requires a majority. So here's what has to happen. It has to go to the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives, the rules are, according to the Constitution, the House of Representatives only takes the top 3. So that leaves Jackson, Adams, Crawford. Clay is out. But what is Clay's position in the United States government? Oh, he's the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Right. So how much influence is he going to sway over this election, which is now going to take place in the body of government that he presides over? Oh, this should be interesting. So Clay knows that he's going to be a very influential figure in this election. So he goes back to the House of Representatives and he's able to muster a whole bunch of votes. So we know that Clay hates Jackson. We know that Clay is never going to elect a man that had a stroke. So that leaves process of elimination. You guys are good at this. You do good on multiple choice. That leaves Adams. So Clay goes to John Quincy Adams and he says, look, Mr. Adams, here's the deal. I will get you the presidency if, here's the bargain, you will make me the Secretary of State when you take over the White House. Adams is no idiot. He says, sure thing, Clay, you've got a deal. There is your corrupt bargain. Jackson, after the election, once Adams gets elected to be president and he makes Clay the Secretary of State, Jackson sees right through this thing like it's saran wrap and says, whoa, time out, hold everything. I know what's going on here. This is a joke. It's a hoax on America. You can't do this. Well, Andy, hate to tell you this, they just did. And it is a corrupt bargain. 1824, corrupt bargain, goes down in history. One of the messiest elections, most corrupt elections ever. Okay, so with the election of 1824 and this corrupt bargain, what we see evolve here is the permanent existence of the two-party system. And you're going to see the Democratic Republicans, or the Democrats, come out in full support of Jackson and his followers, and the National Republicans come out as followers of the Adams-Clay gang. Okay, so the Democratic Republicans support Jackson, and the National Republicans support Adams and Clay. Okay, now the National Republicans advocate for a more active role of government addressing domestic issues, and the Democratic Republicans support states' rights and fiscal conservatism. Okay, so a little bit different than what we see it as today, but you know, that's how it is. Okay, so now the tariff. The tariff in 1828 is probably the most famous tariff in our history because it is known as the Tariff of Abominations. Here's what happens. So John Quincy Adams wants to pass a tariff that protects northern industries, because that's the purpose of a tariff, is to protect our domestic industries, which were just getting their feet under them and starting to develop as viable industries on the world market. And he wants to protect them on the world stage. Well, the writers of the Tariff of 1828 had another plan in mind, because remember, these guys are from Congress, and the committee that's set up to write this tariff, they have another plan. See, they want to create a tariff that's going to make John Quincy Adams look bad. And they create a tariff that's going to get Jackson elected. So they create a tariff that provides limited protection on items produced in states that support Adams in New England, and they produce a tariff that provides good protection on woolen goods from states like Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Ohio, who were questionable in where they're going to throw their support come the election of 1828. So if you provide a good tariff on those products, and they know that it's coming from the Jacksonians that this tariff bill is written, then those states are more likely to support Jackson in the next election. See how this is all going to work? It's very political. So Adams is really furious because he knows that this is such a political fight, and he calls for a higher tariff on stuff from his area of the country, from New England, because that's the whole purpose. And the tariff grows higher and higher and higher. And the southern states, well, they get really upset because the South, they don't have manufacturing. So they don't have a tariff to protect them. They don't have a tariff on raw cotton because it's not a manufactured good. It's just a raw material. So there's nothing protecting the cotton on the world stage, on the world market. It's just out there as a commodity for people to buy, to use, to make into a finished product. So the Southerners, they're really ticked off about this whole thing. There's nothing protecting them and their economy. So the Southerners are outraged. They call it the Tariff of Abominations because all they see is the bottom line. And the bottom line for Southerners is we have to pay more for finished goods, no matter where they come from. So if finished goods are being sent over from England and have a tariff attached to them, they cost us more. If finished goods are coming from New England, the same finished goods, let's say it's a rocking chair, if the rocking chair is coming from New England and they can jack their prices up to just under what Great Britain is charging with the tariff, then we have to pay more for that rocking chair. So the Southerners are really ticked off because the rocking chairs that they like to put on their front porches cost more no matter where they get them from. And their cotton has no tariff to protect it. So they're really upset about this whole issue of the tariff because Southerners have zero protection. They're out there on the gridiron with no pads on, if you get my analogy here. So the Southerners are really, really ticked off. There's just nothing protecting them whatsoever. Whereas the Northerners seem to have all the protections in the world. The same is said of tobacco. There's no protection on the world market for tobacco either. It's a raw material, not finished, and the Southerners are really upset that they don't have a tariff to protect them. But yet they have to pay the higher prices. Tariff of abominations. Now, John Calhoun is so upset about this whole tariff of abominations, he's the vice president, remember, that he actually goes home to South Carolina and he gets to work on a document that expresses not only his outrage, but his argument that states have a right to nullify any federal law they believe violates their basic rights. This kind of goes back to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that Thomas Jefferson advocated back in the early days of the nation. Okay, so he writes this exposition and protest, and he submits it anonymously to the South Carolina legislature, because it would look really horrible if the vice president of the country submits a nullification bill to his state legislature. Yeah, he can't do that with his name on it, so he submits it anonymously. Now, the document advances the doctrine of nullification, which Calhoun hopes would be the means by which states could protect their interests without resorting to secession. He's not willing to use that word yet. He will eventually. He's one of the biggest advocates for secession in the South as we get towards the Civil War. Now, but he's not willing to go there yet. So the first picture you see is of him as a relatively young man. The picture that you're seeing now is of him as an older man, and I suspect this is what he looked like when he was the vice president of the country. Was this more sort of crazy looking guy, he had sort of had it with the federal government at this point. I mean, this guy that goes back to South Carolina and starts advocating for nullification of a federal law, I mean, that sort of indicates that he may be losing it a little bit. So that's Calhoun's story. He wasn't taking it anymore from the federal government. He's had it. He's done. So now, in Latin America, Adams announces in his message to Congress that the newly independent states of Latin America have been called by a man named Simon Bolivar, who you're seeing in this photo. And he's known as the great liberator of South America, and he would like to hold a conference in Panama to discuss matters of common concern and interest. And he invites the United States to attend. Now, this has never really happened before, that the United States has been invited to attend a conference of this nature. So it's sort of an exciting thing. But the problem is that the Democratic Republicans take sharp exception to this, and they don't want to send anybody. They think that this is the conference departs from the established foreign policy of the United States, and we should not send anybody to the conference. Well, that's ridiculous. Really? So they reject the nominations of the two ministers to Panama that John Quincy Adams had sent to the Senate for confirmation. Well, this is just bullheadedness by the people who are running our country. I mean, Really? You're just going to reject the people who were nominated? Come on. So the confirmation of the two ministers was delayed so long that the Panama Congress that had been called by Bolivar had adjourned before our two delegates could even get there. So eventually they're approved, but by the time they get on a boat and they get to Panama, the conference is over. So one of them actually dies en route to Panama, and the other one reaches Mexico City, which is not in Panama, by the way, reaches Mexico City, and he gets word that the conference is done. It's over. Finished. Go home. What a waste. It was a lost opportunity. A chance that we could have really made some inroads with the Latin American and South American nations, had put ourselves on friendly ground with them, and that a long history of cooperation and interaction between North and South America would have been established by this conference. And of course it was blown to pieces by the lack of cooperation by our political rivals in this country. So absolutely ridiculous. All right, so 1828 rolls around, another presidential election, and this was one of the ugliest presidential elections, or filthiest, in American history. Jackson was accused of stealing another man's wife. We'll get to that in a second. Adams, he was accused of actually being a pimp in this election. So get this, supposedly, he had procured an American girl for the Tsar of Russia when he was a U.S. minister serving in Russia at the time. It was an absolutely ridiculous accusation to make, and the accusations just absolutely flew during this time. So what happened with Jackson? So Jackson, this is the story here. Jackson, when he was a young man, a young soldier, he had rented a room in a boarding house, or a room that was being boarded out by this woman named Rachel Donaldson Robards. And she was married at the time to another man who had basically moved out and moved to New Orleans, moved to Louisiana. And she had filed for divorce from him on the grounds of abandonment because she hadn't seen him in years. And she thought that the divorce had gone through, that he had signed the papers, everything was hunky-dory, the divorce had gone through. And then while Jackson was living in her home as a fairly young man while he was a soldier, she fell in love with him and they got married. And what wound up happening is that the divorce didn't go through, and this man found out that she had married Jackson, and he basically filed paperwork saying, excuse me, we're still married. And so when you're married to more than one person at a time, you're a bigamist, and that's against the law. So she had to actually file for divorce again. He had to actually sign the papers, the appropriate papers, this first husband of hers, and finally this Louis Robards, the divorce went through and she was finally able to marry Jackson appropriately. But during the election, all of this came out and she was mortified because people were accusing her of being a bigamist. The press was all over it. It was really very ugly. She was really very embarrassed by the whole thing. And of course, Jackson was a very proud man, and he didn't want his wife being dragged through the mud over this whole thing. So it was very ugly. Now, Jackson in the election, he, when you look at the map here, you'll see that he sweeps the South, the West, and the Northwest. And it's for a total of 178 electoral votes. Adams only gets 83 votes, all of which, look at the map carefully here, all of which come from New England, okay? Out of a population of about 13 million total people in the United States at the time, 1.155 let's see, 1,155,000 of them went to the polls, okay? Now, doesn't sound like a lot out of 13 million people, but remember that a lot of people in the West wouldn't go to the polls because they were frontiersmen and blah, 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 a lot of uneducated people, and also your slave population isn't allowed to vote, okay? So, that's an increase of 800,000 voters over the last election. Now, this is a sign of how democratic the country is becoming. So when we talk about Jacksonian democracy, that's what we're talking about, is how democratic the country is becoming in this age, okay? Now, of that number, 1,155,000, Jackson receives 647,000. Adams receives 508,000, so it's still fairly close, okay, as far as popular vote goes. The republic is evolving into a democracy, but that process is going to be very long, it's going to be very difficult, and ultimately we know, because the Civil War is coming, it's going to be very bloody. Now, when Jackson wins this election and he is inaugurated as the President of the United States, thousands of people crowd into Washington, D.C. on March 4th, 1829. We'd never seen this before. This is a first. And they came to witness the inauguration of President Andrew Jackson. He was sort of the people's president, right? He had won this election in the face of 1824, which everybody saw as this corruption of democracy and this corruption of politics. So now finally the people's president has won, and all these people turned out in Washington to see him take the oath of office. So they were celebrating the inauguration of their hero. So Jackson was, he was sort of the people's president. He was born into poverty. He did not have an immediate family for the first part of his life. He had risen to the highest office in the country. He represented what was exceptional and exciting about America. He was a self-made man, and he was the first guy to win the office of the presidency who could really say that. The people, after he took the oath of office on the steps of the Capitol, on the East Portico, people pursued him as he made his way to the executive mansion. And he had to sort of escape into the executive mansion. And these were the days when people really felt that the White House was their home, so they were able to just go into the White House. And there was no denying anybody, so everybody sort of poured into the White House. And men, women, children, they were scrambling, fighting, romping, doing whatever they sort of felt like doing. And so they sort of busted up the china and the crystal, and it was a melee in the White House during this party that broke out. There were spittoons all over the place, and it was just a general raucous party. It was nuts. And the general destruction of what took place in the executive mansion was so bad that there were basically tubs of punch and wine and ice cream that were taken out into the garden area in order to lure people outside and get them out of the White House, because the staff was really genuinely concerned for what was going to happen to the house. And that seemed to have worked, because the crowd seemed to be tempted enough to leave the interior of the White House and go out to the garden. Men literally dove through the windows out in like hot pursuit of the punch and so forth. They wanted to get to it so badly. And the children wrestled and fought with each other in order to grab the ice cream and other refreshments. It was crazy. It was nuts. So, but everything about politics changed in the Jacksonian era. What had gotten underway in 1879 was not the same by 1829, when Jackson was finally inaugurated. By and large, government was, in 1879, when the Constitution was written and passed, government was not about making money. People served out of service and feeling like they wanted to serve their countries. And they did not regard being a representative or a senator as a lifelong career. So you served for a couple of years and then you went home and you resumed your life, what your real life was. You didn't stay in Washington. By the War of 1812, all of that changed. Now, serving in politics was a lifelong career, and people really adopted it as such. So congressmen served longer terms, and they fashioned their service into a profitable career. But this necessitated winning elections every 2 years if you were a member of the House of Representatives. So, which meant that you had to create strong political organizations within your state or your district, which meant that you had to have loyal followers who gave you lots of money, who gave you lots of political support, to whom you then owed favors. You see where this is all going, right? Okay, so you had to have strong political parties and connections, and this could often lead to you had to have people who were pleased with your performance, and you had to keep happy. So it could lead to lots of corruption in your district. There was lots of pork barreling. That meant that you brought jobs and projects home to your home district. Pork barreling, if you don't know what it means, look it up. It led to conflicts of interest within Congress. It led to wholesale bribery among people and congressmen. It led to lobbying, where people would show up and say, "So, Representative so-and-so, I have a proposition for you. What do you think if we try to pass this bill? Because I think it would be good for our home district." We know how bad lobbying is in Washington today. It was bad then too, in the early days of our country. So really sort of an ugly way to deal with things. There was a man who, a French gentleman who was hanging around in the United States, who was making general observations about what was going on in America, and his name was Alexis de Tocqueville. And if you ever get the chance to read his work, it's called Democracy in America, and it is fantastically wonderful, the observations that he makes about the United States of America and the grand experiment that we do with democracy in our Constitution and the early national period. And he attends sessions of the House and the Senate, and he was really appalled by what he witnessed. And I've included a couple of quotes here about what he sees going on in America, and I'm hoping that you are reading them as I'm talking. Because I think you'll find them very interesting, what he has to say about religion in America, what he has to say about freedom in America, and what he has to say about Congress in America. And I hope you find them very interesting, because they certainly are ringing as I speak. So, and here's what he has to say here. So, on entering the House of Representatives at Washington, he reports, one is struck by the vulgar demeanor of the great assembly. Often there is not a distinguished man in the whole number. Its members are almost all obscure individuals, whose names bring no associations to mind. They are mostly village lawyers, men in trade, or even persons belonging to the lower classes of society. The men in Congress back in the 1820s and 30s were generally not from your higher classes in America. They were generally your tradesmen, your lawyers, and lawyers, remember, were not something that we held in high esteem in America in the 1820s and 30s. These were some of them were fairly rustic. Some of them were sort of backwoodsy. They were not, Some of them, there's reports that one of the representatives from Ohio would devour his sausage sandwich and brush the crumbs off of his coat during sessions of Congress. So it's an interesting take on what was happening in Congress at the time, not sort of the standard we expect of our congressmen today. Of course, when you look at Congress today, maybe it's a higher expectation than what we have today. Okay, I'm going to stop there before I get in trouble. So Jackson's nickname was Old Hickory, and of course he had this nickname because everybody basically perceived him as being as hard as hickory, as far as tough as nails kind of thing. Hickory is a very hard type of wood. It's not soft at all. Anyway, so they called him Old Hickory. But he had a nickname, which was another change in our political scene, because never before had we had a president with a nickname. This was sort of a newfound trend. But he's not the last. None of his predecessors before him had a nickname, but many of the presidents who followed him did. So check it out. Martin Van Buren was the Little Magician. William Henry Harrison was Tippecanoe. James Knox Polk was Young Hickory. Zach Taylor was Old Rough and Ready. So to many commentators of the time, this was sort of a new kind of nomenclature that surely marked a decline in their minds of the caliber of men who served as President of the United States. So not only was Congress declining in the quality of men that it attracted, but so was the presidency. So this was sort of a new trend. It was interesting to see how it sort of, politicians in general were sort of going on a downhill slope. So Jackson had a couple of goals in mind, several as a matter of fact. One of them was that he would have liked to have gotten rid of the Electoral College. We see how successful he was with that, because in 2012, we still have it. But he wanted to get rid of the Electoral College because in 1824 he lost the election, even though he won the popular vote. So he did propose a constitutional amendment to replace the electoral system with a popular vote. He didn't win that one. He also wants to recall all foreign debts from foreign countries that other countries owed us. He wasn't very successful there either. But then he really hits a sore point here. He wants to root out corruption in the federal government as he sees it. So here's how he sees the federal government. So these bureaucratic posts that people seem to occupy within the federal government, not necessarily the secretaries of this, that, or the other thing of the cabinet, but the other underposts beneath the secretaries. He sees them as being these posts that people hang on to year after year after year after year. No matter who the president is, people seem to hang on to them. And he wants to get rid of that, where people just sort of hang on to those positions. He wants to nominate or appoint those positions to his buddies. And we call this the spoils system. He wants to reward political workers with his own appointments. Well, there's people that have a problem with that, namely in the opposition party. They don't want to see that happen because their people are already in place, and they don't want to see him load up the federal government. So what I was saying before I got rudely cut off by the microphone that cut out on me was that the opposition party doesn't want to see Jackson load up with his own people in the bureaucracy. What they would like to see is for their people to stay in place. Well, he wins this one. He puts the spoils system into place. He puts his own people into place. So, but the only person he really has of any worth is Martin Van Buren, who's part of his cabinet. He's the Secretary of State. And he's really the only one who's worth anything in Jackson's entire cabinet. Now, Jackson also has what's called the kitchen cabinet, and this is probably what he's most famous for as far as political appointments. The kitchen cabinet contrary to popular belief, they didn't regularly meet in the White House kitchen. They met wherever it was convenient, and on occasion that might have been the White House kitchen because maybe they were hungry, but it wasn't normally the White House kitchen. It was wherever it was convenient. So it might have been the Oval Office, it might have been the living room, it might have been the family room, it might have been wherever. It was just wherever it was convenient. So that was the kitchen cabinet. Okay, so that concludes Jackson up until he gets into his mess with the Bank of the United States, his election in 1832, the Indian Removal Act, and so forth, the Tariff of 1832 and such. And I'm going to save that for the next video because I don't want to overwhelm this one too much, and I also don't want to be kicked off of SchoolTube. So that I'm going to wrap this video here, and then I'm going to produce yet another one for the rest of his administration, and we'll go from there. So that should do it. I hope this didn't overwhelm you, and we'll go from there. Okie dokie. Thanks, guys. Happy listening. Hope I didn't bore you. Bye.